Great presentation as always, Evan. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, man.
Hey, yeah, guys, if you hit that Q&A button, Evan will take questions now if you have any. Just hit the Q&A button, ask your question, and I'll read them out loud. If you go back to that graph, or you don't even have to go back to it, but looking at that graph, do you lose the connections? Same, I mean, you lose a lot of those connections when you turn a compost. Do you also lose those same amount of connections? Or is there the same damage of losing connections from rototilling your soil?
That's a good question. I would say that I don't know because they didn't do that as part of the study, and I would like to call them and ask them to do it. Might take them 10 years, I don't know, but um, to the point, composting, you know, one, you don't have to turn compost. That does speed the process up because it brings more oxygen into the pile, not unlike what we're doing in compost tea on a much lower level. But the best compost is actually not turned. That's in biodynamic composting. It's a passive cold composting. It's sometimes called if it's a barrel compost specifically. But the reason for that is that it strengthens the microbe. It allows, there's a term called facultative that basically means the bacteria predominantly can be both anaerobic or aerobic depending on the conditions. And if you have a passive pile without turning it, you're going back from fermentation to aerobic and back and forth, and you've created more life experience in the microbe. It's very difficult to measure that other than anecdotally through the result, but that is the case conceptually in my experience. So when you're turning the pile, I don't want to say that it's wrong either, because it's not destroying the fungi. It's destroying the neural network that it's trying to create. But the reality is you're going to spread it onto a field anyway, right? So from a composting standpoint, I wouldn't really be concerned because it's really not possible to avoid it. In a field, the concept of no-till comes from this, right? So yes, you're disturbing the soil when you plow it. I wouldn't personally support the idea that it's wrong to plow. I think it's a personal choice. You just have to know that you're going to have to compensate for the destruction of the food web that you're accomplishing. And in, a separate track, but the same, if you didn't till and you experience the negative repercussions of the food web not being conducive to supporting that growth, you may suffer yield losses in the year to two that you couldn't withstand from a business perspective. So as you know, man, farming is always like pick your battle. So I try not to judge people at all that till, but I think it would be safe to say that you would probably disrupt a lot of those. And the real question that I would ask is of those connections in the midterm, what percentage of them are fungal based versus other organism associations? And I admit to not having studied this study enough to be able to try to answer that, but it's safe to say that you're not disrupting everything. I mean, even if just take the construction worker analogy, the neighborhood's built, somebody blows up a building, or, maybe even you bomb the neighborhood, there's still life that can be undertaken, and there's rebuilding that's going on. So, is it a good thing? No. Is it a necessary thing? I think you'll probably make that argument situational.
Well, looking at the graph, it looks like the blue represents the fungi, and so quite a bit is on it. It's blue, right? And
Yeah.
bacteria is red.
Yeah, I mean, you can see there's a greater number of red, and you can see that there are associations between bacteria, which is really interesting. Because typically when you think about this type of communicative association from the surface, it's a fungal association. So, one of the things to draw from this visual is that it's not just fungi communicating information through the food web. And what's another fascinating question is, how does that communication happen, right? I mean, how does a bacteria talk to a bacteria? That's maybe beyond my pay grade without having reviewed this Nature publication, but it is kind of fascinating to see.
Well, I imagine there's a lot of the bacteria are feeding off of each other, as
Mhm.
well as communicating with each other about what they're feeding on, bumping into each other or pushing each other away from other food sources, things like that.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it
Or
might not
just a
just be,
competition.
yeah. I mean, it might not be competition. It might be a conversation. It might be a food web type association. You can take a bacteria like Bacillus subtilis. It's a natural soil-borne organism that's been turned into many different gardening products that eats and mitigates fungal outbreaks. It's a fungicide that's biological. So they concentrate it in a petri dish to a product level that you can get a concentration of Bacillus subtilis you couldn't in nature because of the balance concept, and you can treat the fungi after it expresses itself. Well, that very well might be a communication, right? It might be a reliance. So it's safe to say that this is very dynamic and more of like a metadata type visual thing, more so than any kind of literal thing. But the takeaway for me is that it's not that you won't get immediate relevance in the food web, but we work with a lot of commercial growers, indoor commercial growers, and they're most 99% of them, maybe less than that, I don't know, but based on the ones we see, are throwing their potting soil away when they're done, and then they're starting over. Well, a lot of them want to reuse the potting soil. They just are kind of afraid to do that. But the question that I always ask is, well, you can't really make a food web in a container that you're, putting on a tarp, letting break down the dead roots, remineralize it, put it back in the soil. How much of that are you really, establishing a mature food web? Kind of like to your point in composting, I'm sure there's a lot of disruption, which is why indoor growers, subsidize with fertilizer. But it's also not the case that they're not getting a benefit from it. I mean, the extreme example would be hydroponics. You can use compost tea in hydroponics, and you're not going to set up the food web in water, but there are definite microbe species that balance out the Pythium and the Fusarium that are just rampant everywhere and that rear their head in poor conditions. Those are stunted by the balance that you brought from the tea. And you would add it, when reservoir changes, for example. So the goal is not necessarily to set up the food web. And it's still bringing all sorts of residual benefits from a protective standpoint, from a nutrient cycling standpoint. And also they unlock salts that may be used in hydroponic fertilizers. So it's not always about having to make it perfect, if you will, for lack of a better word. I don't really mean that in real sense. It's about gaining the benefit by bringing them to the table. So even if you were disrupting the pursuit of perfection in that conversation, you'd still be getting a lot of benefit out of it.
And do you think climate has a lot to do with this as well? Like, I mean, some people. So typically, or at least when I think of rototilling, for example, turning the soil. A lot of people are turning the soil to loosen the soil so it's easy to plant in. Other people are rototilling to mix materials into the soil. Um, and I like to, if I'm going to rototill, I want to rototill one time to get things set up because I'm usually dealing with perennials instead of annuals.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to rototill once and be done with it.
Right.
And when I'm rototilling, I want to rototill materials in that are going to be useful for the microbiology in the soil, as well as loosen that soil up so I can get planted into it. Um, but when I think of different climates, that might work great for me because I'm in a northern climate where we get a freeze every winter, and a lot of that biology dies off, or at least is halted until the spring and summer when the snowmelt comes.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering. I imagine you can get a greater long-term connectivity, especially in the fungal and the bacterial, in warmer climates where the soils aren't getting frozen out like that.
Well, that's an
Or
interesting
what are your
thought.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, a couple things come to mind. One is in the winter, it's easy to think that microbes die and start over. But in my at least intellectual experience, it's difficult to document these sorts of things. Is that when nature the rate at which nature works allows microbes to form cysts and go dormant and protect themselves, which is why you can buy microbes off a shelf in a proper garden center. So they sporulate from a fungal stance, and they also create cysts that protect them. So one of the things like with brewing tea is that you've grown the balance of the microbes to such an extraordinary population that they don't have time to go dormant, which is why you need to use it in a day or two. With composting, that process is more passive and within the realm of a natural expectation. So you tend to protect the organism from that standpoint. So that's one point. And from the climate standpoint, it's if you, and I agree with you totally. If you've got a new agricultural scenario like a lawn that you ripped up and you got a hard pan, you have to till the soil to work with it, right? Just physically. And the goal would be with proper agronomic practice that you wouldn't have to come back and do that. And it's not just a biological conversation. It turns out that a lot of subsoil this happens in, but it also happens in the topsoil. When you have a magnesium ratio that's higher than, say, a 3-to-1 to calcium, which is tended to be where you want. Say it's 2-to-1 or even. I've seen it before. High magnesium creates a tightness in the soil. The element is smaller than calcium, so it creates a lack of porosity in the soil and creates the hard pan. So you can actually break up that soil. So to make the point, if you had an improper calcium to magnesium ratio and you broke the soil up, what you're going to experience within that season and definitely by the next season is the hard pan condition came back again. And that's a lot of what people, that sometimes it's unconscious that they avoid it because all they're adding is lime. But if you're adding dolomitic lime, it actually is a 2-to-1 ratio as opposed to the 3-to-1 that you want. So if you're using dolomitic lime over time because the extension said your pH was low or whatever the case may be, you're actually lowering that ratio and you're tightening your soil. So one of the things you get out of really good base saturation soil testing is understanding that ratio. So instead of dolomitic lime, you would want to use a high calcium lime that had, instead of 20% magnesium, 3%, for example. So from an elemental standpoint, you can make sense of why the soil creates a lack of porosity. And so the third thing that it came to mind is, I mentioned Stuart Lundy, and he's and I also mentioned the earth breathing, and the energy being in the earth in the winter. And it turns out then that, and I've never seen data that documents this, but the conceptual framework there is that you actually get a higher warmth capacity in the earth in the winter, which is odd, but it is relevant. And that's why the BD 500 prep is buried in the winter and the 501 is buried in the summer. For example. And it's also, I can't remember the word, maybe somebody else can remember it, of greenhouses that are buried under the ground, a tapini or something like that, I think it is. And the conditions that you can create by going underground is creating a higher level of warmth. So the inference that I'm making there is that it's easy to think the ground freezing through and all the microbes are in harsh conditions, but it very well might be that the conditions are conducive to maintain their life in the earth in that capacity. So I can't prove that in any kind of way, but it is sound in regards to how the biodynamic methods are undertaken.
Well, I'm thinking when the ground freezes, all right, so the microbiology, maybe they're going deeper, but I would think that the communication is definitely slowing. However,
Right.
in places that do get the more northern climates, they're also getting a lot more sun during the summer, and so
Mm.
maybe they're communicating longer during the summer, which is why you get rapid, fast growth in the higher climates,
Huh.
but you get a lot less decomposition
Yeah, yeah.
compared to the warmer climates,
And
right?
if you yeah, that's an interesting thought. And if you integrate, like, the poor soil conditions of the tropics are due to the rate of activity. Any of the chop and drop that happens naturally in a forest is completely consumed by the rate of biological decomposition and also the rate of agricultural, not agricultural, but of the plant growth, the flora that's there to consume it. So it turns out that, that's what terra preta is. They figured out how to farm forest soils by retaining more of it in the soil zone. So I think if you integrate that concept too, what I think I heard you say, which kind of hits me in the right way, is that you've got a smaller window in the northern latitudes, but it kind of balances itself out. That's kind of, I've never really thought about it in that way, but that's kind of a cool thought form there.
All right, we have some questions. I better get to instead of taking up all your time with mine.
Hmm.
Let's see here. Eric's question is, what would be a good source for my initial inoculating of my compost and or compost tea?
Shameless plug. You can go to our website, microbemakers.com, and we have compost tea brewing kits, and do our best to guarantee the utmost of diversity. And from a consulting standpoint, I like to offer that as an initial way of inoculating to kind of check that box, because the mindset goes to, well, how do I verify it? And we talked, at some length about how that's really a misnomer. We can't really tell ourselves what's supposed to be there because we don't even know what's supposed to be there yet. So rather than identify it, it costs $200-300 to get a good biological test, and rather than spend that money, I would just source our compost tea, or frankly, you could go scratch the forest floor, Go get 10 of your buddies' compost, some worm castings, put all that together, and just focus on diversity. And that's the best that you can do. It's you can send it to a lab to identify. The value of the lab is that it identifies the four trophic levels being present. From there, there's not much more that you can get out of it. So, basically what we've done is done that for you. And in the best case scenario, you would start with a small brewing kit, brew up some tea in a 5-gallon bucket, inoculate your compost, and in concept and in actionable ease, you could make compost tea out of your own compost. You can imagine if you're making compost tea out of just turning a pile and oxidizing it and doing the motions, that you're just kind of spinning your wheels. So there's other sources out there. Alaska humus soil. I did a soil test on a raw Alaska soil the other day, and it completely blew my mind because it had a huge exchange. No, what was it? A huge organic matter. I think it was like 20%. 4 is acceptable, but it had basically like a 1.5 exchange capacity, which 7 is beginning to be acceptable, which makes no sense. And that's part of the name of the game. Again, the further you look, the less you know. But biologically speaking, that product is pretty good. And I see, if you have a microscope, basically best you can do is identify it. There's some courses out there you can pay a lot of money for to learn more about that. There's some books that you can look for. Teaming with Microbes by Jeff Lowenfels is a really good layman book. And you don't really, if you got a complete inoculant, you don't really have to know what you're doing. That's kind of the beauty of microbes. They self-organize. So, hope that was helpful.
And also to that question, Eric, is we might have a course coming out soon that will help you with that. If
Right.
well, there
Okay.
will be more coming on that.
That's right.
Let's see here. Question from Lee. Where do viruses fit in this scheme? Fungi, bacteria, weeds, and insects seem to be omnipresent and infest when the conditions beckon them. But I don't see a similar mode for viruses. Any thoughts?
Wow. Lee, that's a really good question. Um, Short answer is I don't know. And it's that's one of those questions where when you ask it, it feels like I should have a better answer. To be honest with you, I'm not familiar with viruses performing any beneficial function in the food web. It's like when my kid asked me, why were fleas and mosquitoes invented, and the best answer I got is for the bats. But viruses are a different animal, right? They're dynamic and almost undefinable, and they're adventitious. So there was a guy that I was connected with, Greg Willis, a long time ago, that had this dialogue about fungi, parasitic fungi, and parasitic microbes in general, that they were taking advantage of a weakness in the system. So one way of looking at it is to say that viruses exist to weed out the weak, and that's maybe not a satisfying answer, but I think maybe the best that I can do. But I tell you what I am going to do is maybe I'm going to look more into that from a food web perspective and see if I can't drum anything up, and I'll include it in the future talks if I can find anything. And if you do, send me a note, man. That's a really good question. I don't know.
Yeah, it's something we don't think about much is viruses in the microbiology
Yeah.
of how they affect the soils. Because I imagine there are viruses that affect certain microbes and could wipe them out. And maybe there is a benefit to why that happens.
I don't even know that I
Of
can
course, when we
conjure
look at
up.
humans,
Yeah, I mean, in humans it makes sense, but I don't know that I've ever really heard of a viral outbreak in plants. And that may just be I'm not connecting that dot, but that's just it's interesting. I don't know.
well, let's see. What about trees? Isn't there some kind of viral outbreak in trees in this like the southern or eastern states? If that's going
Yeah,
on to
when
happen?
you say that, I don't know the name of it, but it might be on the chestnut trees in eastern North Carolina or western North Carolina. I believe that there is some sort of viral outbreak. Um, but I'd have to
Or
look.
some kind of fungus that
Yeah, but fungi wouldn't be a virus, right? And that's what's throwing me the curveball is that you wouldn't include. It's kind of like almost like aluminum in soil testing. Every lab does it, but they do it from a toxicity standpoint because the aluminum's not really needed by the plant, so it's typically not focused on from a fertility standpoint. Um, but I can't say that I've ever, in all of my years working in progressive gardens and doing this stuff, that I've ever had a documented case of a viral outbreak on a food crop. Um, I'm gonna get to the bottom of
Maybe
that.
that's why the aluminum's in the soil.
Yeah, well, crazier things have happened for sure. But yeah, I'm gonna look into that and get an answer.
All right. Thank you once again, Evan. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We will see you next week. And I'm excited for next week's the composting talk.
Yeah, man, dig it. Appreciate you. Just everybody
Bye,
out
Evan.
there. See you next week.